I was 32, standing in the crystal hall of New Harbor's finest restaurant, when my father raised his glass and called me a burden. 50 millionaires held their breath. My 5 years of patience were about to close in 10 minutes, capped by a legal maneuver that stunned the room. What they didn't expect was this. I didn't come seeking acceptance. I came to read the clause they had all just triggered. My name is Sabrina Calloway. Tonight, on my 32nd birthday, I was seated in the private oak room of Maison Delacroix, a fortress of old money and culinary snobbery perched high above the rain-slicked streets of New Harbor. The storm outside was relentless, a cold sheet of water hammering the tall, arched windows, distorting the city lights into a blurry, indifferent watercolor. Inside, the air was warm, almost suffocatingly so. It was thick with the competing scents of beeswax from the polished mahogany walls, hothouse lilies dying slowly in massive vases, and the faint, metallic tang of damp wool from expensive coats that had been whisked away by silent attendants. The room glittered, but it was a cold glitter, not just from the trio of massive crystal chandeliers, but from the armor worn by the women. They were draped in diamonds that looked less like adornments and more like collateral. Their laughter was high and brittle, a sound like expensive glass shattering on a marble floor. The tables were draped in linen so heavy and white it looked like sculpted marble, stark against the dark wood. Every place setting was a fortress of baccarat crystal and antique silverware, so intricate and heavy it felt absurd to eat with. And the clocks. My father, Gregory, always insisted on this room because of the clocks. A collection of ornate, gilded monstrosities lined the mantelpiece, each a masterpiece of Baroque inefficiency. Their ticking was a maddening, unsynchronized chorus, a dozen different rhythms all measuring the excruciating passage of my time. I wore a simple black sheath dress. It was well made, but quiet. I wore no jewelry, save for the thin, practical steel watch my grandfather had left me. Its face was scratched. Its band was worn. It was a deliberate choice, an act of quiet defiance that only served to make me a starker silhouette against the room's opulent backdrop. I was a void in their field of vision. The other women, peacocks in silks and jewels, looked through me, their eyes scanning the space for relevance and finding none in my corner. Their conversations were a low, constant hum of acquisitions, second homes, new boats, children accepted into Ivy League schools. This was not a birthday party. It was an audience, a command performance. My father had curated the guest list himself, and his criteria were simple. You had to be worth $50 million, minimum. The room was filled with the titans of New Harbor, men and women whose assets started at 8 figures and climbed aggressively upward. There were fund managers whose quiet decisions could destabilize a small country, tech CEOs who spoke in a rapid-fire language of acronyms and valuations, and real estate investors who saw the city skyline as their personal chessboard. They were not my friends. They were my jury. They were the witnesses. At the head of the long, imposing table, my father, Gregory Calloway, held court. At 58, he was the very picture of established predatory power. The chairman of Ridgeline Urban Partners. His silver hair was perfect. His suit was bespoke. He radiated an aura of expensive, unshakable confidence. He paused his story to check his platinum watch. A Patek Philippe, always a Patek, as if timing the arrival of his own punchline. Rare wine, a 1982 Bordeaux that cost more than my annual teaching salary, was being poured by sommeliers as casually as water. He was the sun, and everyone in this room orbited his gravity. Beside him, his wife, my stepmother Vivian, watched me. Her face, pulled tight from recent maintenance, held a tight, knowing smirk. She adjusted the heavy diamond necklace at her throat, her eyes flicking to my simple dress and back, the judgment clear. Her laugh was a sharp little chime, a punctuation of agreement to whatever Gregory said. And then there was Lena, my stepsister, 5 years my junior, and already the celebrated vice president of development at Ridgeline. She was holding forth, her voice deliberately pitched to carry over the din. boasting about her new $50 million watercress project. Phase 1 is completely pre-sold, she announced, beaming at a rapt banker. Gregory says my projections were too conservative. She kept glancing at me, her eyes bright with a malice that was almost gleeful, childish in its transparency. A small, offensively bright orange box sat by her plate. My gift, prepared and wrapped with the precision of a venomous dart. The first of the 12 courses arrived, a single, perfectly seared scallop sitting in a swirl of unidentifiable green foam. I looked at it, this elaborate, tiny offering on a plate the size of a hubcap, and saw it for exactly what it was. A prop. This entire evening, the 12 courses, the endless crystal, the obsequious waiters who materialized and vanished like ghosts. It was a stage, a very expensive, meticulously constructed stage designed for one purpose: my public execution. My humiliation was the evening's main entertainment. They were here to watch the burden be formally cast out. My hand tightened on the simple leather clutch in my lap. I could feel the sharp edge of the envelope inside. I thought of my grandfather, Harlan Calloway, the founder, the man who actually built Ridgeline Urban Partners from brick dust. Calloused hands and sheer nerve. I remembered the smell of his study, old books, pipe tobacco, and the faint, sharp scent of the cedarwood chessboard. He'd sit with me for hours, long after Gregory had dismissed me as a lost cause. His large, rough hand, the knuckles swollen from a lifetime of work, would hover over the polished ivory pieces. They will try to take everything, Sabrina, he'd told me, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Just a month before he passed. We were playing a game. I had just lost my queen. I was devastated. He tapped my king. You lost your loudest piece. You did not lose the game. Sometimes, you must sacrifice your most powerful-looking piece to get the pawn to the other side. They will underestimate the pawn. They will call it weak. They will ignore it. He pushed my pawn forward. But the pawn, Sabrina, the pawn is the only piece on the board that can become a queen again. He gave me a hard look. They will take the houses, the money, the recognition, but knowledge, you build that inside yourself. It is the one asset they can never, ever steal. You wait, child. You learn the board, and you do not move until you have checkmate. That was 5 years ago. 1,825 days of waiting. Inside my clutch, resting against my knuckles, was a single, thick envelope. It was sealed with the dark blue wax insignia of his private legal firm. I had never opened it. The instructions from his lawyer, Martin Blake, had been explicit. Wait until your 32nd birthday. Wait until they force your hand in front of witnesses. My calm tonight wasn't numbness. It was the absolute, vibrating stillness of a predator that has waited 5 long years for the prey to walk directly into the snare. I had learned the board. I had memorized every move they made. The room buzzed around me. The conversations were loud, forced, fueled by expensive wine and the palpable tension of a public spectacle. I caught the glances, the quick, pitying looks from men and women who had known me since I was a child. Before their eyes darted away, afraid to be caught showing solidarity. It was the kind of pity that feels more like contempt. In 2 hours, not one person had walked over to my end of the table. Not one person had said, "Happy birthday." I was a ghost at my own feast. I was the designated sacrifice. The 12th course, an elaborate chocolate sphere that dissolved under hot caramel, was cleared away. The dessert wine was poured. The ticking of the dozen clocks on the mantelpiece suddenly seemed deafening in the brief lull. A frantic countdown. Then, the signal. The restaurant manager, a tall, impeccably dressed man whose professional smile was cracking under the strain, moved to the head of the table. He cleared his throat, his nervous reflection visible in the dark, rain-streaked windows behind Gregory. "If I may have your attention, ladies and gentlemen," he murmured, though his voice carried with amplified importance in the sudden, expectant hush. The room went utterly silent. The clinking of silver stopped. The 50 millionaires turned their gaze forward, their faces arranged in masks of polite interest. This was the moment they had been promised. Gregory Calloway pushed back his heavy oak chair. The sound of its legs scraping the floor was violent. He stood, lifting his crystal glass of golden dessert wine. The light from the chandelier caught the platinum on his wrist, sending a sharp glare across the table. He looked directly at me. His smile was thin, sharp, and utterly devoid of warmth. The performance was about to begin. Gregory beamed, his glass held high. The crystal caught the light, a miniature sun in his fist. "Friends, partners, esteemed colleagues," he began, his voice a practiced, resonant baritone. It was the voice he used for hostile takeovers and keynote addresses. It was a voice that did not ask for attention, but commanded it. "We are here tonight to celebrate achievement, to look forward, to celebrate the future of Ridgeline Urban Partners." He turned his gaze, full of manufactured paternal pride, upon Lena. She was seated directly to his right, absorbing the adoration as if it were oxygen. "A future embodied by my daughter, Lena," Gregory declared. Lena fairly vibrated with triumph. She blushed, a practiced, modest lowering of her eyelashes that fooled no one in this room of sharks. "In just 2 years," Gregory continued, his voice swelling, "Lena has spearheaded the $50 million Watercrest project, bringing it in under budget and ahead of schedule." This was a spectacular lie. I knew from my own contacts, primarily my grandfather's old chief financial officer, Margot, that the Watercrest project was a financial black hole, a vanity project hemorrhaging money that was being creatively hidden by shifting liabilities. But facts were irrelevant tonight. Tonight was about narrative. "She is sharp, she is dedicated, and she is the future of Ridgeline," he finished. The room erupted in obligatory applause. Several of the investors, men whose funds were deeply, perhaps fatally, tied up in Watercrest, clapped the loudest, their faces masks of strained, desperate enthusiasm. They were not clapping for Lena. They were clapping for their own money, praying Gregory's assessment was true. Gregory let the applause die down, his smile tightening. He then turned his head, very slowly, toward my end of the table. The warmth evaporated from his face, instantly replaced by a look of theatrical, weary obligation. The spotlight, unseen but intensely felt, swung from Lena and landed hard on me. The air in the room grew thin. "We are also here," he said, his voice dropping half an octave, the resonant warmth replaced by a flat, dismissive tone. "For Sabrina's birthday, her 32nd. He paused, the silence stretched, aching and vast. The ticking of the dozen clocks on the mantelpiece, previously a charming background hum, suddenly rushed in to fill the void, a frantic, unsynchronized countdown. He took a slow sip of his wine, making us wait. 32 years, he mused, looking at the ceiling as if consulting a ledger visible only to him. It's a significant milestone. It's the age when a person must reckon with their choices. As a businessman, I've always believed in a diversified portfolio. You invest in various assets, hoping they all mature. Some exceed expectations. He nodded again at Lena, who preened. Then his eyes, cold and blue as glacial ice, found mine. They traveled over my simple black dress, my lack of jewelry, my very presence at his table. "And some," he said, the words dropping like stones into the profound silence, "are proof that not all investments pay off." It was not a laugh that filled the room. It was a series of sharp, startled intakes of breath. It was the sound of 50 millionaires, men and women who navigated hostile boardrooms for a living. Suddenly and desperately, finding their dessert plates fascinating, a few people, the ones most beholden to him, offered weak, gurgling chuckles. It was the wrong kind of laughter, a sound of profound discomfort, terrified of Gregory, embarrassed for me. I heard a muffled cough from the far end of the table. I heard the distinct, sharp clink of a silver fork being dropped onto porcelain by a nervous hand. I did not look down. I did not blush. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes level on his. I held his gaze. I watched him enjoy the ripple of discomfort he had caused. This was his true dessert. He savored the power, the ability to define me as a loss, a write-off, in a room full of self-proclaimed winners. I was his public charity case, the living embodiment of his one failed venture. Vivian, seeing her cue, leaned forward, her diamond necklace scraping against the table's edge. "Gregory, darling, you forgot the gifts." Her voice was syrupy, laced with a false sympathy that was sharper than any insult. With two perfectly manicured fingers, she slid an offensively bright orange shopping bag across the white linen. The color was a violation, a neon scream in the tastefully muted, candle-lit room. It stopped just short of my wine glass. "From Lena," Vivian added, her smile not reaching her eyes. Lena, her face a mask of false sweetness, chimed in, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Go on. Sabrina, open it. We all wanted to get you something appropriate for your lifestyle." I reached for the bag. The paper handles were crisp. The room was silent, watching me, a pack of well-dressed wolves waiting for the wounded animal to cry out. I pulled out the contents. It was a white t-shirt. The cotton was thin and cheap, the kind that becomes transparent after a single wash. It smelled of vinyl and chemicals. Printed across the chest in thick, bold, black letters was the phrase, "Another year of disappointment." The second wave of reactions was worse than the first. This was not a subtle jab. It was a shiv, slid between the ribs and twisted for everyone to see. I heard a woman gasp, a sharp, shocked sound. I heard a man mutter, "My God, Gregory, that's enough." I held the shirt up for a moment, letting the ink dry in the warm air, letting the message sear itself into the memory of every witness in the room. I looked at the cheap stitching along the collar. Then I looked at Lena, who was smiling, her eyes bright with victory. "Thank you, Lena," I said. My voice was even, quiet, polite. I laid the shirt on the table, methodically. I folded it. I made a perfect, neat square, smoothing the wrinkles from the insulting words. I folded the cheap cotton until it was a small, manageable block. Then I placed it on the table, directly to the left of my dessert plate, next to my folded linen napkin, as if it were just another part of the place setting. The room held its breath. My refusal to break, to cry, to react, had stolen their climax. I had taken their best punch, and the silence that followed was mine, not theirs. Gregory's eyes narrowed. My calm was a profound insult to him. He had orchestrated this grand humiliation, spent a fortune on this stage, and I had denied him the payoff. He decided to escalate, to move to the kill. "Well," he snapped, the thin veneer of joviality gone, replaced by cold, brutal command. "Now that the pleasantries are over." He reached into the breast pocket of his dinner jacket and produced a sheaf of folded documents. He tossed them onto the table. They landed next to the neatly folded t-shirt. He followed it with a heavy gold-capped fountain pen, which he slid across the linen until it tapped against the papers. The sound was sharp, final. "These," he said, his voice low and menacing, "are transfer of inheritance papers, a waiver. Sabrina, your signature, relinquishing any future claim on the Calloway estate, the trust, or ridgeline." I stared at the papers. I did not move. "You are 32, he continued, leaning on his hands, towering over the table. "The free ride is over. You will sign those papers tonight, here, or you are cut off, completely." He began to list the items, as if foreclosing on a bad property, his voice gaining strength with each word. "That means the health insurance policy. That means the monthly allowance you seem to think is an entitlement." He was careful not to name the amount. In truth, it was a meager sum dictated by my grandfather's will, just enough to be a perpetual, controlling leash. "It means the apartment, the car, and any and all family privileges. You will walk out of this restaurant tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back and that useless teaching job at that charity school." He straightened up. satisfied. He had laid his trap: sign and be publicly disinherited, refuse and be publicly cast into destitution. The 50 millionaires watched, their faces grim. This was the blood in the water. I let his threat hang in the air. I let it settle over the room, letting its poison seep into the expensive linen. I let every single person absorb the full transactional brutality of the ultimatum. My eyes scanned the faces. I saw the investors, the bankers, the tech CEOs. They were uncomfortable, yes, but they were also Gregory's partners. They were compromised. They would not cross him. But then I found her. Seated near the middle of the table, unassuming in a dark gray suit, was Judge Elaine Porter. She was a recent appointee to the State Superior Court, known for her sharp mind and an absolute intolerance for procedural nonsense. She wasn't an investor. She was here because her husband's firm managed one of Ridgeline's smaller insurance portfolios. She was, relatively speaking, an outside observer. She was not looking at her plate. She was not looking at Gregory. She was watching me. And unlike the others, she was not hiding her disgust. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. Her eyes were not pitiful. They were analytical. She was committing this to memory. She was a witness, a credible witness. That was all I needed. The snare was set. The witnesses were in place. The public humiliation had been delivered and documented. I took a slow, deep breath. The chaotic ticking of the clocks on the mantelpiece seemed to slow down, to synchronize, to merge into a single, steady heartbeat. I did not reach for the pen. My hand moved, instead, to the leather clutch in my lap. My fingers closed around the thick, stiff edge of Harlan's envelope. I felt the hard, raised circle of the wax seal under my thumb. I drew it out. I placed the envelope on the table, on top of the neatly folded t-shirt. The dark blue wax and heavy cream parchment looked ancient, powerful, next to Gregory's flimsy, modern legal papers. Gregory stared at it. What is that? More of your sentimental nonsense? A poem? I looked up from the envelope. I met his gaze. The entire room, all 50 millionaires, Vivian, Lena, and Judge Porter, leaned in. Before I sign, I said, my voice clear and carrying easily in the dead silence, I have a few lines I need to read. My hand rested on the heavy cream parchment. The envelope felt warm against my cold fingers. The dark blue wax seal, bearing the Callaway C entwined with Harlan's personal H, was unbroken. It felt like a dormant heartbeat, a promise made 5 years ago, waiting for this exact moment of atmospheric pressure. Gregory snorted. Well, are we waiting for a drum roll, Sabrina? Or did you forget how to read? Lena giggled, a sharp, unpleasant sound. Maybe it's just pictures, Daddy. It's a letter, I said, my voice cutting through their noise, landing in the quiet with absolute finality. I looked around the table. It's a 5-year-old contract. This wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't a lie. It was a covenant. The memory of that day was vivid, sharper than the rain-slicked windows beside me. My 27th birthday. It was 3 months after Harlan's funeral. The house, his house, not Gregory's sterile mansion, still smelled of his pipe tobacco and the old wood of his study. I was numb with grief. Gregory and Vivian had already started redecorating, which meant liquidating his history, selling off the furniture that held his shape. Martin Blake, Harlan's personal lawyer, a quiet, precise man, Gregory despised and dismissed as the help, had called me to the study. He'd handed me this exact envelope. Harlan was very specific. Sabrina, Martin had said, his voice gentle. These are his final instructions for you. You are not to open this. He tapped the wax seal. Not until your 32nd birthday. Not a day before. Why? I had asked, my voice raw from crying. Why wait 5 years? Martin adjusted his glasses. Harlan believed in time. He said 5 years is long enough for greedy men to get sloppy. He said, she must wait until they fully reveal their nature. They will forget her. They will underestimate her, And then they will try to break her. When they do it publicly, that is when she will be ready. He looked at me, his eyes full of a gravity I didn't understand yet. He said, "When they hand you the knife, that is when you show them the shield. He trusted you to wait. Can you do that?" I had nodded, clutching the envelope. "Yes." "Good," Martin said, "because a duplicate, fully executed and notarized, has already been filed under seal with the Harbor County Probate Court. It is timed release. It becomes the active, binding addendum to his will at exactly 8 p.m. on your 32nd birthday, tonight. The first year was the hardest. The grief was a physical weight. But Harlan's instruction gave that grief a purpose. It wasn't just patience, it was preparation. It was a 5-year education in an undeclared war. I stopped deleting the messages. I created a folder on a triple encrypted drive. I named it Evidence. I saved the voicemail from Gregory after I refused to attend a fundraiser for one of Lena's vanity projects. "You ungrateful little, you are a line item. Sabrina, a rounding error. You will show up, or I will personally terminate that lease." I saved the email from Vivian, sent to the entire family, detailing my struggles and asking them to pray for me, a thinly veiled attempt to paint me as unstable. I saved the text from Lena. "Just saw the allowance deposit. Must be hard living on scraps. Don't worry, I'll buy you next time you're allowed at the club." I documented every time I was excluded from a family meeting, every time I was seated at the kids' table at 30 years old, every snide remark, every whispered insult. I gathered them, not with anger, but with the cold, dispassionate precision of an accountant. Each entry was dated, timed, and cross-referenced. "A contract?" Gregory scoffed in the present, pulling me from the memory. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing to the room. "With whom? Your imaginary friends? Sign the damn papers. Sabrina, or I'm calling security to have you removed." Judge Porter's head lifted, her eyes sharpening at the word removed. She was logging that, too. I ignored him, my mind back in the trenches of the last 5 years. While they were busy insulting me, I was busy studying. I had a degree in literature. They saw that as useless, but Harlan had always said, "Literature is just the study of contracts, motives, and consequences." He wasn't wrong. I used the meager allowance they despised to pay for night courses online, corporate finance, contract law, forensic accounting. When they were at galas, I was at the public library, digging through archived municipal records of Ridgeline's first developments. And late at night, I would go to Harlan's study, which Vivian had locked. I still had the key. I opened his old ledgers, the real ones, from before Gregory digitized everything and hid the numbers behind firewalls. The paper was thick, fibrous. The numbers entered in Harlan's elegant, sloping script. It smelled of ink and time, and it told a story. It took me 2 years to piece it together. 2 years of cross-referencing incorporation papers, trust agreements, and proxy statements. The revelation came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, the rain outside reminding me of tonight. Gregory didn't own the company. He ran it. He did not own it. His personal stake, the shares he'd inherited outright, amounted to barely 20%. The rest, the controlling interest, the vast majority of the voting shares, was not his. It was held in the Harlan Calloway Revocable Trust, a trust that Harlan had controlled completely, a trust that, upon his death, was supposed to pass to a new trustee. But the trustee designation was blank in all the public copies. Gregory had simply assumed control, and no one, not the board, not the investors, had dared to challenge him. They assumed he was the heir. He acted the part. I needed the missing piece. I found it in Margot Stone. Margot was the chief financial officer. She had been with Harlan since the beginning. She was quiet, steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun, a woman who wore sensible shoes and saw the world in spreadsheets. Gregory tolerated her because she was brilliant, but he treated her like furniture. I ambushed her in the parking garage, away from the office cameras. She saw me, and her face, usually impassive, softened for just a second. "Sabrina, you look just like him." "Margot," I said, "I've read the ledgers, the old ones. I know about the trust. I know Gregory only holds 20%. Her blood ran cold. I saw it in her eyes. "You should not be looking at those things." "Harlan told me to," I said. "He told me to wait, and he said to find the protector. He said you were the protector." Margot Stone stopped breathing. She looked around the concrete garage. "He said that?" "He did." She unlocked her car, a practical, 5-year-old sedan. "Get in." We drove to a diner miles away, over bitter coffee. She told me. She was the failsafe. She had the other copy of the trust agreement, the one Gregory never knew existed. "Harlan named a successor trustee," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The name was to be revealed by Martin Blake upon the execution of the addendum. This thing you're holding." She looked at me. "I've been watching him run this company into the ground. Sabrina, the debt he's hiding in Watercrest, the shell companies. Harlan built Ridgeline to build homes. Gregory is building a house of cards." From that day, I had an ally. Margot fed me the real numbers. The reports Lena wasn't faking. The transfer orders Gregory was trying to bury. My hardest task was not the studying. It was the waiting. It was the practice of standing still. I had to let them do it. I had to endure the insults. I had to take the t-shirt, to hear the word burden, to be handed the waiver. I had to let them cross every conceivable line of decency, publicly, while I documented their every step. My calm was not weakness. It was strategy. It was the discipline of a sniper who cannot move, cannot even breathe, until the target is perfectly aligned in the crosshairs. Inside my locked closet at home, I kept a simple paper calendar. Every night, I would draw a single red X through another day. 1,825 X's. The last X was drawn this morning. My choice to teach at Northside Elementary, the public school in the city's poorest district, was the final piece of their narrative. They saw it as my ultimate failure. Working for peanuts, Gregory called it. A charity case, teaching charity cases. They missed the point. It wasn't a failure. It was my armor. It was my anchor. For 5 years, while I navigated their world of lies, my days were spent in a classroom full of 9-year-olds. They didn't care about Ridgeline, or trusts, or stock prices. They cared about whether I showed up. They cared about the stories I read. They taught me what real value was. My work at Northside wasn't a failure to live up to the Callaway name. It was my deliberate choice to live up to Harlan's name. He built homes for people like them. I was trying to build a future for their children. This useless job, as Gregory called it, was the very thing that proved I was the only one who understood the legacy he was trying to destroy. And now, here, in this room, the 5 years were over. The countdown was at 0. The clocks on the mantelpiece ticked. The rain lashed the windows. Gregory's face was a mask of thunderous impatience. "My patience is at an end. Sabrina, sign it." I looked at him. I looked at the neatly folded t-shirt. I looked at the waiver he had slid across the table. And I looked at the envelope. "I will," I said. "But not this." I tapped his papers. "This." My hand was perfectly steady. The 5 years of waiting had burned away every last nerve, every trace of fear. All that was left was the cold, hard certainty of the board. "Harlan was very specific," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "He knew this night would come. He knew you would do this." I turned the envelope over in my hand. "He called this the behavioral clause, and tonight, Father, you all just triggered it." With a clean, sharp tear, I broke the 5-year-old seal. The sound of the thick parchment tearing was the only sound in the room. It was louder than the rain, louder than the ticking clocks, louder than the panicked breathing that had begun at the head of the table. I unfolded the document. It was 3 pages, heavy linen stock, covered in Harlan's elegant, forceful script, written with his preferred fountain pen. At the bottom of the third page was his signature, bold and unmistakable. Beside it, the embossed, raised seals of the notary public and the Harbor County Probate Court. Gregory's face was a mask of confusion and rage. "What is this nonsense? I told you, this is over." "This," I said, my voice resonating with a calm I had spent 5 years building, "is the supplemental addendum to the last will and testament of Harlan T. Calloway." I held it up, showing the seals. "Executed and filed under seal, with the explicit instruction that it be opened and read on this date, November 10th, 2025, at the hour of my 32nd birthday, an event which, per my birth certificate, occurred at 8 p.m. "It's fake," Lena hissed, her eyes wide. "Daddy, it's fake." "It is not," I said, "and it contains several provisions for this exact moment, but the most important one is Clause 7.3. I will read it aloud." I lowered the document and began to read. My voice did not shake. I had practiced this. I had memorized this. Clause 7.3, the behavioral mandate. Should any member of my family, or any officer of Ridgeline Urban Partners acting as their proxy, engage in the public insult, humiliation, or coercion of my designated heir, Sabrina H. Calloway, said actions shall trigger an immediate and irrevocable consequence. I paused, letting the words settle. Humiliation, coercion, insult. All 3 triggers had been pulled. "I continue," I said, my eyes finding Gregory's. "Public law, for the purposes of this clause, is defined as in the presence of no fewer than 30 reliable third-party witnesses." Harlan even provided a suggested, though not exhaustive, list of said witnesses. I glanced at the second page of the addendum. He lists fellow board members, financial partners, auditors, managing directors of investment banks, and acting or retired members of the state judiciary. I looked up from the page. My gaze swept the room. I looked at the tech CEOs. I looked at the fund managers. I looked at the bankers. And then I looked directly at Judge Elaine Porter. "A room," I said, "just like this one, filled with people just like you." "This is ridiculous!" Gregory slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal jump. "This is a farce. It's inadmissible. I am the executor." "Which brings me to my next point," I said. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I placed it on the table. Next to the folded T-shirt, I pressed a single button on the screen. The room filled with the sound of a speakerphone dialing. It rang once, twice. A voice answered, crisp and dry as old paper. "Martin Blake." "Martin, this is Sabrina Calloway," I said clearly. "Miss Calloway," he replied, his voice amplified by the phone, cutting through the heavy, astonished silence. "I am here, as per our prior arrangement. This call is being recorded, transcribed, and time-stamped, under legal authorization from the Harlan Calloway Trust." Before Gregory could explode again, another voice spoke, a woman's voice, strong, clear, and full of an authority that had nothing to do with money. Judge Elaine Porter. She had not moved, but her entire presence seemed to expand. "For the benefit of all parties present," she said, her voice sharp and projective, "I feel it is my duty as an officer of the court to advise you, given the presentation of this notarized and sealed addendum and the confirmation from legal counsel, all parties should consider themselves to be speaking, in effect, under the witness of the court. I strongly advise you to proceed with extreme caution." It was not a request. It was a ruling. The room, which had been simmering with whispers, went dead silent. Vivian's hand, which had been reaching for her wine, froze in midair. "Blake!" Gregory roared at the phone, his face turning a dangerous, blotchy red. "What is the meaning of this? You are my father's attorney. You answer to me. The will was read 5 years ago. It is settled." Martin's voice from the speaker was utterly unbothered. It was the voice of a man who had been holding 4 aces for half a decade. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "you are mistaken. The document read 5 years ago, dated March 12th, 2015, was indeed the public will. You were named executor of that document. However, this supplemental addendum, which Miss Calloway now holds, was executed and filed under seal on May 1st, 2018, 2 months before Harlan's death. The timeline hung in the air. 2 months, a final, brilliant move. This addendum, Martin continued, his voice precise as a scalpel, contains a specific revocation clause, Section 1, which supersedes all prior directives only concerning the control of the Harlan Calloway Revocable Trust. It is, as of this moment, the law. Miss Calloway, please proceed to Section 2. I looked back at the document. My hands were steady. Section 2, I read. The transfer of control. Upon the execution of the mandate in Clause 7.3, or upon my granddaughter Sabrina H. Calloway's 32nd birthday, whichever shall occur later, all voting shares and controlling interest of the Harlan Calloway Revocable Trust, comprising 51% of Ridgeline Urban Partners, shall transfer immediately and fully to her. The number landed like a bomb. 51%. Not 20, not a minority stake, not a seat at the table. Controlling interest. 51%, I repeated, letting the words echo. It's not 8 p.m. yet, Lena stammered, grabbing her own phone, her face pale with a sudden, dawning terror. You said on your birthday, it's not... I didn't even look at her. I looked at my own simple steel watch. Then I lifted my phone from the table. The screen glowed. My phone, I announced, reads 8:09 p.m. The activation threshold of 8 p.m. has passed. The behavioral mandate was triggered at approximately 8:05 p.m. The transfer is complete. Vivian made a small, choking sound, like a bird being strangled. You can't, Gregory whispered. He looked around the room, at the 50 millionaires, his witnesses, his jury. He was looking for an ally. He found none. He found only the cold, calculating stares of investors who had just realized their money was now in someone else's hands, as if summoned by the thought. A new sound entered the room. It was not a gasp. It was a vibration, a digital chime. Then another, and another. A cascade of notification pings from phones all around the table. Heads dropped. Investors, bankers, and CEOs frantically pulled their devices from pockets and purses. A man at the far end, a hedge fund manager named Ames, looked at his screen, his eyes wide. "What the hell?" he muttered. At the same time, Margot Stone, Harlan's CFO, who had been sitting silently at the very end of the table, looked up from her own phone. She had not spoken a word all night. She spoke now. "The automated protocols have executed," she said, her voice clear and carrying. Gregory's head snapped toward her. "Margot, what are you talking about?" Harlan set up a dead man's switch. "Gregory," Margot said, standing up. "A 3-key system. It required the activation of the legal addendum from Martin, the time lock of 8 p.m., and my own confirmation of the behavioral event, which I logged at 8:06 p.m. She looked at her phone again. "The servers have just executed the directive. As of 8:09 p.m., all administrative access, keycards, and digital credentials for Gregory Calloway and Lena Calloway have been revoked. The board structure, per the trust's automated directive, has been updated to reflect the new majority shareholder." She looked directly at me, her face grim but resolute. "Welcome to the board, Miss Calloway." The room exploded, not in sound, but in a vacuum of shocked silence, immediately filled by a tidal wave of frantic, terrified whispers. 51%? Access revoked? He just lost the company. My God. She planned this. It's a coup, a legal coup. Lena was shaking her head, tears of rage and disbelief welling. "No, no, 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 Daddy, make them stop, make her stop." Vivian just stared at the folded t-shirt on the table, as if it were a snake that had just bitten her. Gregory stood frozen, his wineglass still in his hand. He looked at me, his face ashen, his eyes full of a new, horrifying understanding, The bravado was gone. The power was gone. He was no longer the predator. He was the one in the snare. The 50 millionaires were all on their phones, their thumbs flying, no longer looking at him, but at their stock portfolios, their legal teams, their escape routes. The king was dead. I folded the addendum, placed it back in its envelope, and set it on the table. Then I picked up the pen he had tried to force on me. I did not sign his waiver. I clicked it open. "Now," I said, looking at the pale, stunned faces of my family. "I believe we have some new business to discuss." I held the pen. Not his waiver. The click as I retracted the gold nib was sharp, decisive. "Gregory, you began this toast by celebrating achievement," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the stunned silence. "You spoke of Lena's watercress project as the future of Ridgeline. Let's talk about that future." I looked down the table to where Margot Stone stood, her face impassive. "Margot, the report, please." Margot nodded. She lifted her iPad from her lap. It was not a personal device. It was a ruggedized tablet, the kind used for secure field operations. She tapped the screen, and the device's glow illuminated her face. "You can't," Lena sputtered, her face ashen. "That's company proprietary. It is company proprietary," Margot said, her voice flat. "And Miss Calloway is now the majority shareholder. She has a right to the data, all of it." Margot turned the iPad, its large screen facing the center of the table. "This is the forensic analysis of the Watercress project, compiled by an external auditing firm I engaged 6 months ago, funded by Harlan's private trust, the one you didn't know about." On the screen, a series of graphs and flowcharts glowed. They were devastatingly simple. "As Gregory stated," I said, "Lena has been in charge of this $50 million project for 2 years. I pointed to the main chart. A thick red line plunged downward. And for 2 years, it has not turned a profit. It has, in fact, been operating at a catastrophic loss." "That's a lie," Lena shrieked, half rising from her chair. "Our quarterly reports, they show growth." "Your quarterly reports," Margot interjected, her voice like ice, "show a complex cycle of cash flow transfers. You've been funding Watercrest's deficits by pulling liquid capital from Ridgeline's legacy properties, the ones Harlan built. You've been moving debt between shell corporations to mask the losses from the investors. It's a classic Ponzi structure. Lena, you've been paying old investors with new investor money. While the core asset continues to bleed, it is, by legal definition, borderline securities fraud." A new, colder silence fell over the room. The investors were no longer looking at me. They were staring at the iPad, their faces pale, the blood draining from their faces. They were doing the math. "I continue," I said. "Let's talk about the expenses you did file." Margot swiped the screen. A new page appeared, a long list of itemized expenses. "Your partner development budget, Lena, was particularly ambitious," I said. "Last month alone, you expensed over $200,000 in wine. You filed a receipt for a single case of Bordeaux that cost more than my annual salary. Who were you developing? Lena? A sommelier?" I pointed to another line item. "And the yacht, $90,000 for a 3-day client retreat in the Caribbean. Except the client manifest matches the guest list for Vivian's birthday party." Vivian, who had been perfectly still, flinched as if slapped. That's standard industry practice," Gregory blustered. But his voice was thin, reedy. The command was gone. He was defending. He was losing. "Is it?" I asked. "Is it also standard industry practice to pay your golf partner for services not rendered?" Margot swiped again. A new chart appeared, showing a steady stream of payments from Ridgeline's operational budget to a single LLC. "This is Harbor Consulting," I explained to the room. "An LLC with no employees, no website, and no office. Its mailing address is a post office box in a strip mall, and its sole proprietor is a man named Jack Riley, who, according to club records, has been Gregory's golf partner every Wednesday for the last 10 years. I looked at my father. Harbor Consulting has billed Ridgeline for over $3 million in geotechnical surveys for the Watercrest project, surveys that were never performed. It was, I'll grant you, technically legal. You filed the paperwork, but it was, by any measure, unethical. It was theft, plain and simple. You were paying your friends with investor money. A low groan came from Richard Ames, the hedge fund manager at the end of the table. He looked sick. "We knew it," he said, his voice a low rumble of fury. He looked at the investor next to him. "Our auditors. They flagged this. They flagged the volatility 2 quarters ago. We were told it was a simple restructuring." Another investor, a woman who ran a massive pension fund, spoke up, her voice shaking with rage. "We were preparing to pull our funds. We were just waiting for the next quarterly report. You've been lying to us for 2 years. Gregory?" "All of you!" Gregory yelled, pointing a trembling finger at them. "You all got rich off me. Off Ridgeline." "No," I said, my voice quiet. "They got rich off my grandfather. You have been making them poor." I turned my attention to my stepmother. "Vivian." She looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. "You were not an employee," I said. "You were not even on the board, though you held a title, and yet you held a Ridgeline corporate card, an executive-level black card." Margot swiped the screen. Vivian's expense reports appeared. $400,000, I read. "In 18 months, on this card, spa treatments, clothing from boutiques in Paris and Milan, hair appointments, dinners at restaurants I've never heard of, all flagged by risk management, all personally overridden and approved by Gregory, filed under corporate spousal relations. You, Vivian, are a $400,000 line item. You, who sat there and smirked when he called me a burden." Vivian made a small, wounded sound and finally, blessedly, looked down, her face crumbling. The room was a tinderbox of financial panic and personal shame. This was the moment of the turn. I held up my hand. "Listen to me, all of you." The investors, my father, Lena, they all looked at me, the new center of gravity. "My priority tonight is not personal," I said, and I meant it. "It is the company. It is the legacy my grandfather built. It is the 400 employees whose pensions you've been gambling with. Gregory, I have no interest in seeing Ridgeline Urban Partners collapse in a criminal investigation. It would destroy the livelihoods of everyone who works for us, and it would wipe out every investor in this room." I looked at my family, Gregory, Vivian, Lena. They were broken, defeated, terrified. "So this is the offer. For tonight, you will cede control. As the trust dictates, you will stop interfering, you will walk away, and in return, I will focus on saving the company, not on filing criminal charges. That is my only concern." It was a truce, an act of mercy. It was not one Lena was capable of accepting. Her face, which had been pale with shock, contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. It was the tantrum of a spoiled child who had just had her most expensive toy taken away. "You!" she shrieked at me. It was a raw, primal sound. "You worthless, jealous, nothing!" She grabbed her full glass of dark red wine. With a violent, jerky motion, she hurled it. I saw it coming. I saw the dark liquid arc across the white linen. I had spent 5 years learning to stand still. I did not flinch. I did not raise a hand. I did not even blink. The wine hit me square in the chest. The cold, sticky liquid splashed across my face, into my hair, and down the front of my simple black dress. The smell of fermented grapes and alcohol was instant, overwhelming. Drops of red spattered the white tablecloth around me, like blood. The room gasped. It was the final shocking violation. Lena stood there, breathing hard, her hands still raised, her face a mask of ugly triumph. She let out a short, barking laugh of contempt. Her laugh died instantly. 2 men, dressed in simple black suits with earpieces, had materialized behind her. They were not restaurant staff. They were private security, Margot's security. One of them placed a large, firm hand on Lena's shoulder. "Miss, you need to come with us." Lena's eyes went wide. She tried to pull away, but the man's grip was iron. "Get your hands off me! Daddy!" Gregory did not move. He was staring at the red wine dripping onto the floor. As the security guard began to firmly escort Lena from her chair, Judge Elaine Porter spoke, her voice ringing with cold, judicial clarity. "Let the record show," she said, her eyes on the security guard, "that I have just witnessed a public, unprovoked assault, and I am noting," she added, her gaze shifting to Lena's still contemptuous face, "the clear and present lack of remorse." The blood drained from Lena's face. The word assault and record had finally, fatally, pierced her bubble of entitlement. I slowly picked up my linen napkin and began to dab, calmly, at my face and neck. The napkin came away stained deep red. I looked at the restaurant manager, who was hovering by the door, his face a mask of absolute horror. "This room has cameras," I stated. It was not a question. This was Maison Delacroix. Of course it did. He nodded, speechless. "I want the footage," I said, my voice quiet but firm. From every angle, from the moment my father stood up to speak, until this moment now, I want it extracted, placed on a drive, and sealed in an evidence bag. Martin Blake will send a courier for it within the hour. Do you understand? He nodded again, vigorously. Yes, Miss Calloway, of course." I dropped the stained napkin onto the table, a splash of red on the pure white. "Good," I said. "Now, let's finish." I stood there, the cold wine stinging my skin, dripping from my hair onto the pristine white linen. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Lena's ragged breathing as the security guard, Mr. Evans, held her arm. His grip was professional, unyielding. "Let go of me. You do not know who I am," she spat, her voice ugly. "We do, Miss Calloway," Evans said, his voice flat. He was not restaurant staff. I recognized his lapel pin. Calloway Security, an older legacy division of Ridgeline that handled asset protection, a division Gregory had sidelined and dismissed as Harlan's old toys. "Ms. Stone contracted our services this morning. Miss Calloway," he said, looking at me, not Lena. He was reporting for duty. "Our orders were to stand by for your directive." Margot, of course. She had prepared for this. She had anticipated the violence of their entitlement. Lena was marched out of the room, her protests echoing and then abruptly cut off as the heavy oak doors swung shut. The room was left with the aftermath, the scent of spilled wine, the scattered crystal, and the sudden, violent vacuum of power. I slowly picked up the stained napkin and deliberately, calmly, wiped the wine from my face. I set the napkin down on the white cloth, a splash of red, a flag of surrender, theirs, not mine. I looked at my father. He was staring at the space where Lena had been, his mind clearly unable to process the speed of his own unraveling. I pressed the speakerphone button on my phone. "Martin, are you still on the line?" "I am here, Sabrina." His voice returned, steady as a rock. "The recording is active. I have logged the assault." "Good," I said. "Please log the following directives, issued by me as the new majority shareholder and acting chair of the Harlan Calloway Trust." The entire room, all 50 millionaires, leaned in. The wind had not just shifted, it had reversed direction, and it was now at my back. Effective as of midnight tonight, Gregory Calloway's employment as Chief Executive Officer of Ridgeline Urban Partners is terminated, for cause. Gregory made a sound, a strangled gasp. He looked as though I had just struck him. His face, which had been red with rage, was now a sickly pale gray. Effective immediately, I continued, Lena Calloway's employment as Vice President of Development is terminated, for cause. Effective immediately, Vivian Calloway is removed from her honorary seat on the board, and all associated committees, all corporate privileges, credit lines, and access are revoked. Vivian finally broke. She let out a low, agonizing wail and buried her face in her hands. Her diamonds, the ones bought with corporate spousal relations, rattled against the crystal. The sound was pathetic. "I am calling an emergency meeting of the Ridgeline Board of Directors," I said, my voice unwavering. "For this Monday, 9 a.m., at headquarters. The agenda will be the formal election of an interim CEO." Gregory finally found his voice. It was a weak, paper-thin rasp. You can't. The board. They won't. It's not a quorum. You can't hold a meeting without me. I am the chairman." "Martin," I said. Martin Blake's disembodied voice was immediate and brutal. "Mr. Calloway, per the Trust's bylaws, which you clearly never read, the definition of a quorum is a majority of eligible, standing members. As of midnight, you, Lena, and Vivian are no longer eligible. As you have been removed for cause under Clause 7.3, your shares are no longer voting, your seats are vacant. The remaining 5 members constitute the full eligible board. A majority of 3 is required. The meeting, and any vote taken, will be perfectly legal. We have the quorum." It was a masterstroke. Harlan hadn't just left me a key. He had dismantled Gregory's entire defense system 5 years in advance. He knew his son. He knew his son would never read the fine print. I looked at the security supervisor, Mr. Evans, who was now standing by the door. "Mr. Evans, Mr. Calloway, and Mrs. Calloway are now free to leave. They are guests of the restaurant, no longer hosts of this event. Please ensure they are assisted to their car, no harassment, no force, just see them out." I was not them. I would not make a spectacle of their humiliation. The act itself was enough. Evans nodded, his face impassive. "Yes, ma'am." He and the other guard moved, not toward Gregory, but to flanking positions by the door, a clear, silent indication that their time at the head of the table was over. Gregory stood, his legs unsteady. He looked down the long, imposing table, his eyes scanning the faces of his partners, his colleagues. He was searching, desperately, for one ally, one person to stand up, one person to object. He found nothing. He saw 50 millionaires suddenly fascinated by their phones. He saw bankers who refused to meet his gaze. He saw men he had played golf with for a decade suddenly studying the wood grain of the table with intense interest. His power had been absolute, built on fear and bluster. And in its absence, there was nothing left. He was a ghost. He and Vivian, a weeping, broken figure clutching his arm, walked the long, silent path down the oak room and out the doors. The doors closed. The room, my room, exhaled as one. Then, the pivot. Richard Ames, the elder statesman of New Harbor finance, the man Gregory had been trying to impress all night, stood up. He was tall, silver-haired, and possessed an aura of gravity Gregory had always tried to imitate, but never achieved. He walked the length of the room. He stopped directly in front of me, ignoring the wine staining my dress, ignoring the mess on the table. He extended his hand. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice a low, respectful baritone. "Mr. Ames?" I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, dry. "That," he said, a small, wry smile touching his lips, "was the most extraordinary shareholder meeting I have ever attended. Some of us," he gestured to a few of the other senior investors, "have been deeply concerned about the direction of Ridgeline for years. We've been waiting for a return to integrity. It seems Harlan left one last, brilliant succession plan." That was the signal. The dam broke. A woman in a sharp suit, Sarah Jenkins, the representative from Harbor National, our primary lender, was next. She looked energized, her eyes bright. "Miss Calloway, Sarah Jenkins, the bank, we've been hesitant to extend further credit on the Watercrest project for obvious reasons, but given this change in leadership and this clear new mandate, If you are planning any kind of corporate restructuring that includes a social responsibility fund, I want you to know the bank would be very interested in providing significant seed funding. We want to be in business with this version of Ridgeline. The money was pivoting. It was following integrity. Before I could respond, another guest, Councilwoman Davies, stepped forward. She was a guest of one of the tech CEOs, a political sharpshooter known for getting things done. Miss Calloway, Councilwoman Davies, I couldn't help but overhear your CFO's analysis of Watercrest. Frankly, the city has been fighting that project's zoning for a year, but if it's as financially troubled as you say, I have a proposal. The city is desperate for mixed-use, affordable housing. If you were willing to restructure the project to commit 30% of the units to our affordable housing lottery, I am confident I can get you the tax abatements and zoning variances to make the entire project solvent and profitable within 12 months. I looked at them. Ames, the investor, Jenkins, the banker, Davies, the political engine. In less than 2 minutes, I had a new coalition, I had validation, I had funding, and I had a life raft for my biggest financial disaster. I nodded. The plan Harlan and I had discussed, the one I had been building in my head for 5 years, finally clicking into place. Thank you. Councilwoman Davies, my team will be in your office on Monday morning. We accept that meeting. And Ms. Jenkins, thank you. The fund is already part of the new charter. I turned to the whole room. They were silent, attentive. They were my audience now. My father said I was a burden, I said, my voice strong. He was right. In a way, I was a burden on his way of doing business. Because I am my grandfather's heir, and Harlan Calloway built this company to build homes, not just speculative assets. We lost that vision. We are finding it again, tonight. I held up my hand, ticking off the new mandate. First, effective immediately, I am announcing the formation of the Harlan Education Fund. 10% of all net profits from Ridgeline Urban Partners will be placed in this fund, dedicated to providing first-generation college scholarships for the children of our employees and for the residents of the communities we build in. I let that sink in. The failed teacher was making education the company's new cornerstone. Second, our board is a relic. It is a monument to my father's friends. As of Monday's meeting, I am proposing new corporate bylaws. Within 6 months, the Ridgeline board will be restructured to be comprised of 40% women and 30% minority members. And unlike our previous commitments, this one will have enforcement mechanisms tied directly to executive compensation. The room was stunned. This wasn't just a takeover, this was a revolution. Ames nodded, slowly. That's aggressive, Miss Calloway. And it's brilliant. You'll have my vote. The tide had turned. The power had not just shifted, it had been rebuilt. On a new foundation, in 10 minutes, the dynasty was dead. The legacy was about to begin. The morning after felt like waking up from a fever. The rain had passed, leaving New Harbor scrubbed clean, the air sharp and tasting of salt. I walked into the Ridgeline headquarters at 7 a.m. The lobby was quiet, the marble floors gleaming under the recessed lighting. Frank, the head of security, was at the main desk. He was a good man, hired by Harlan 30 years ago. He had always been polite, but distant, trapped in Gregory's sphere. As I approached, he stood up straighter, a new light in his eyes. "Good morning, CEO," he said, his voice formal but warm. I paused, the title feeling foreign, ill-fitting, like a suit of armor I had not yet learned to wear. "Good morning, Frank," I replied, offering a small smile. "Please, just call me Sabrina." Frank smiled, a genuine, relieved expression that transformed his face. "Yes, ma'am, Sabrina, it's good to have you here, ma'am. Mr. Harlan, he would be very proud." "Thank you, Frank. I hope I can live up to that." "You already are," he said, simply, and buzzed me through the executive turnstile. The elevator ride to the top floor, the 40th, was silent. I used the new keycard Margot had waiting for me with the building's concierge. The doors opened onto the executive suite. It was a vast expanse of gray carpet, steel, and glass, all of it cold and impersonal. Gregory's office, my office, was at the end of the hall. A massive corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The air inside was stale, suffocating. It smelled of Gregory's cologne, an expensive, musky scent that clung to the leather and the dark mahogany. It was the scent of arrogance and entitlement. My first act as CEO was not to check the stock ticker. It was not to call a meeting. I walked across the vast, silent room, past the 9-foot slab of polished granite that served as a desk, and forced open the windows. They were heavy, designed to be sealed, but I put my shoulder into it until the latch gave way with a heavy thud. A blast of cold, clean, damp sea air rushed into the room. It swirled around me, scattering a few pointless papers on Gregory's desk. It was the smell of the real world, the smell of the harbor Harlan had built his first warehouse on. I stood there for a full minute, just breathing, letting the wind blow the ghost of my father out of the room. When I finally sat in the enormous leather chair, it felt like a throne built for someone else. I turned on the computer. The screen lit up, and the emails flooded in, hundreds. A torrent of messages from the night before, timed just after 10 p.m., from the investors, Ames, Jenkins, Davies. They were all variations on a theme. Eager to discuss next steps. Full confidence in the new leadership. Let us know how we can support the transition. The money was relieved. The money was ready to follow. Then there were the press requests. The Wall Street Journal, the New Harbor Business Chronicle, Bloomberg. An unprecedented transfer of power. Ridgeline heir ousts father in boardroom coup. The woman who toppled the Callaway dynasty. They all wanted an interview, a statement, the juicy, bloody details. I typed the same short reply to every single one of them. My assistant, my new assistant, poached from the marketing department after Gregory's had resigned in solidarity, sent it out. Thank you for your interest. Ridgeline Urban Partners is entering a new phase of rebuilding and integrity. We will not be defined by last night's drama, but by our next actions. We will let the work speak for itself. I minimized the window, the work. I called an open meeting for 10 a.m., not with the executives. They were scrambling. I knew that. But with the department heads, the managers, the people who actually ran the company. They filed into the main boardroom, the one where Gregory used to hold his terrifying quarterly reviews, and they looked scared. They sat at the edges of the room, as far from the head of the table as possible, clutching notepads like shields. They were expecting a new tyrant. I did not sit at the head of the table. I sat in the middle, in one of the regular chairs. I poured myself a glass of water from the same pitcher as everyone else. "Good morning," I said. "My name is Sabrina. I know this transition is abrupt. I want to be very clear. The era of closed doors and top-down fear is over. This is now an open-door meeting, which means I want to hear from you. What is broken? What have you been trying to fix for years that no one would listen to? What do you need, right now, to do your jobs well?" The silence was deafening. They stared at me. Finally, a woman from Human Resources, someone I recognized from the background of company photos, spoke up. You mean that?" "I do," I said. "I am not my father. I am not interested in projects that exist to flatter my ego. I am interested in building a stable, profitable, and proud company. We can't do that if the foundation is rotten. You are the foundation, so, please, talk to me." And then, they did. It started as a trickle, and then it became a flood. Inefficient supply chains, outdated software, a culture of harassment in the sales department that had been covered up by Gregory's inner circle. A brilliant junior analyst's proposal for green roofing that had been laughed out of a meeting by Lena. I didn't make promises. I took notes. I assigned Margot, who sat beside me, to create task forces for the 3 most urgent issues: For the first time in a decade, the people in that room were being heard. When the meeting ended, they walked out not with fear, but with a look of stunned, cautious optimism. That evening, I was working late. My desk, which I had swapped for a simpler, functional one from the open-plan office, was covered in reports. There was a soft knock at my open door. It was Maria, a woman in her 60s, part of the nightly cleaning crew. She had been with the company longer than I had been alive. She held a polishing cloth in her hand, her face kind, etched with lines. "I am sorry, miss," she said, her voice soft, accented. "I did not mean to bother. I will come back." "No, Maria, please," I said, standing up. "Come in. You aren't bothering me." She stepped in, hesitantly. She looked at the office. "He never left the windows open." She smiled. "A small, warm thing. It smells good, like the ocean." "I thought so, too," I said. She looked at me, her dark eyes full of a wisdom that went beyond balance sheets. "Your grandfather, Mr. Harlan, he was a good man. He knew my name. He knew my children's names. When my son was sick, he made a call to the hospital. He paid. He never told no one." I felt a tightening in my throat. "He was a very good man." "Yes," she said. She looked at me, a long, appraising look. "He always told me about you. My Sabrina," he would say. "She has the heart for the work, not just the head, the heart. He believed in you, Miss." Tears pricked my eyes. "Thank you for telling me that. Maria, I need to hear that." "You are doing good," she said, patting my arm. "You are bringing back the light. God bless you." She turned and left, quietly, leaving me alone in the scent of the sea breeze, feeling for the first time like I might actually belong in that chair. The work of the next few days was brutal. Margot's forensic audit was finalized. It was worse than we thought. The $10 million lost to Gregory's buddy contractors was just the start. The creative accounting on Watercrest was a labyrinth of fraud. My first instinct was to call the district attorney, to burn it all down. But I thought of Maria. I thought of the 400 employees. I thought of Harlan's name. Instead, I had Martin Blake draft a letter. It was delivered to Gregory's house, his new, much smaller, rented condo. It was not a lawsuit. It was an offer. The letter laid out, in excruciating, non-negotiable detail, every single dollar he and Lena had diverted, misspent, or stolen. It detailed the fraud, the shell companies, the golf partner, and it ended with a simple, quiet proposal. "You will return every cent. You will sign over your remaining 20% of non-voting shares to the Harlan Education Fund as restitution. You will sign a legally binding agreement to never interfere, publicly or privately, with the business of Ridgeline Urban Partners again. In exchange, the company will not pursue criminal charges against you or Lena. You have 48 hours. It was not revenge. It was restitution. It was the only way to save the company and cleanse the name. The same day, Vivian's lawyers contacted mine. She had read the morals clause in her prenuptial agreement, the one Harlan had insisted on. It stipulated that any public act of moral turpitude or criminal fraud, by either party, would void all spousal support. Gregory's actions, and her own complicity, had triggered it. She was quietly, efficiently, moving out, desperate to settle before the full forensic report became public. The news, sanitized for the public, hit the markets. Ridgeline Urban Partners announces major restructuring, Callaway family to divest. Sabrina Callaway assumes CEO role, pledges return to core values. Our stock, which had wobbled, suddenly ticked up, a single point, then another, then 3. The market, it turned out, loves integrity. But the most telling sign was internal. Margot sent me a report from Human Resources. Since my open-door meeting, they had received over 200 internal applications. People wanted to move. They wanted to build. They wanted to be part of the new Ridgeline. It was a flood of resurgent hope. That Friday, despite the chaos, Despite the 16-hour days, I kept my most important appointment. At 3 p.m., I walked into my classroom at Northside Elementary. The smell of chalk dust, cheap cleaning supplies, and kids was a welcome shock. "Miss Calloway," a little girl named Rosa shouted, running to hug my knees. "We thought you weren't coming. We thought you were a big boss now." I knelt down, hugging her back. "I am a boss," I said. "But this is my most important job. Now, who remembers where we left off in The Giver?" For 1 hour. I was not a CEO. I was not a Calloway. I was just Miss Sabrina. I was their teacher. It was the one place my name meant nothing, and my actions meant everything. It was my anchor. It was the value system that had kept me sane for 5 years, and it was the one I would use to rebuild my grandfather's legacy. The work had, indeed, begun to speak. The text message came 2 weeks later. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the tone of the request was unmistakable. It was Lena. She asked to meet. She didn't suggest a private room at a Michelin star restaurant. She suggested a 24-hour diner off the I-95, a place called the Harbor Light, wedged between a truck stop and a budget motel. It smelled of stale coffee, fried onions, and desperation. I saw her before she saw me. She was huddled in a cracked vinyl booth by a window that overlooked the highway, the endless stream of headlights illuminating the rain, the designer labels, the armor of her former life, were gone. She wore a simple gray sweatshirt and jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a way that was functional, not fashionable. She looked small, hollowed out, and profoundly ordinary. She was tracing the scars in the laminate tabletop with a fingernail, her gaze locked on the meaningless pattern. I slid into the booth opposite her. The vinyl hissed against my coat. "Lena." She jumped, a short, sharp, startled movement. Her eyes, red-rimmed and bruised with exhaustion, flew up to meet mine. The fiery defiance from the party was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was a raw, animal fear. "Sabrina," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse. A waitress, her face etched with a similar exhaustion, appeared with a steaming coffee pot. "Hun, just the coffee?" I nodded. "Black, please." The waitress poured the thin, dark liquid into a thick ceramic mug. She looked at Lena. "You want one?" Lena just shook her head, her eyes dropping back to the table. The waitress sighed and moved on. We sat in a heavy, awkward silence, broken only by the clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the roar of trucks on the interstate. I wasn't going to speak first. She had called this meeting. I waited. "I have nothing," she finally blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. "He cut me off. Gregory, our father. He cut me off. He blames me. For the wine. For you. He says I pushed you too far. That I triggered it." I said nothing. I just sipped the coffee. It was thin, bitter, and scalding hot. "The accounts are frozen," she continued, her voice cracking. "The condo was in Vivian's name. They're gone. I don't know where. I'm staying on a friend's couch. Sabrina. A friend I didn't even know I had. She was waiting for me to say something, to offer sympathy, to feel pity. Pity is a seductive emotion. It makes you feel magnanimous, generous, but it is also a poison. Harlan had taught me that. Pity without accountability, he'd said, is just enabling. "Why are you here, Lena?" I asked, my voice quiet, even. "I need a job," she said, the humiliation of the words costing her what little pride she had left. "Please, Sabrina, I'll do anything. I'll file papers. I'll get coffee. I'll do data entry. Anything. I can't be this." I put the mug down, the ceramic clicking sharply against the table. "I have to ask you a question first, and I need you to be honest with me. Not with me, actually, with yourself." She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, fearful attention. "Are you here because you're sorry for what you did?" I asked. "Or are you just sorry you got caught?" Her gaze faltered. She looked away, back out the rain-streaked window at the passing headlights. "What's the difference?" she mumbled. "It's the only difference," I said. "One is remorse. It's the beginning of change. The other is just inconvenience. It's the beginning of your next con. I can't help you. Lena, if this is just an inconvenience..." She was quiet for a long time. I could hear the cook shouting an order, the sound of a heavy truck gearing down on the exit ramp. "I don't know," she finally whispered. It was, I realized, the first truly honest thing I had ever heard her say. The bravado, the performance, it was all gone. I don't know who I am," she said, her voice breaking. Her eyes met mine, and the fear was eclipsed by a terrifying, hollow confusion. All I ever was Lena Calloway, vice president. My whole life. It was the car, the accounts, the sound my heels made in the lobby. That was me. She leaned forward, her voice dropping, cracking with a shame so profound it was painful to watch. "When I walked in here tonight, the waitress, she didn't know me. She just looked through me. She called me Hun, like I was nobody." A tear finally escaped, tracing a clean path through the exhaustion on her cheek. "I'm nobody without the company. Sabrina, I don't know how to be." I looked at her, this shell of a person, hollowed out by the very status she had worshipped. She wasn't evil, she was just weak. She was a void, taught from birth to value only the reflection of power, not the source of it. "You're right," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "You are a nobody, because you never built a you to be. You were a title, you were a project, you were an echo of Gregory's ambition. And now that the echo has stopped, you've realized there's nothing left." She flinched, as if I had struck her. "That's cruel." "No," I said. "The t-shirt. Another year of disappointment. That was cruel. This is the truth. This is the diagnosis. You had to make me small so you could feel big. Because deep down, you knew you were just a title, and you knew I was something else." "I was a teacher," I said, "which you saw as pathetic, but I was Miss Calloway. I had an identity I earned, one that had nothing to do with Gregory. You were just a name on a door. And when the name on the door changed, you disappeared." She was crying openly now, silent tears of comprehension. "You want a job?" I asked. "You want to come back? Fine, here is the condition." She looked up, her face a mess of hope and fear. "You're going to go find a you. You're going to volunteer. Not at a gala committee. I mean, you are going to get your hands dirty. You are going to go to the Northside Community Center. You're going to serve meals at the soup kitchen. You're going to read to kids at the after-school program. You're going to go work with people who have nothing, and you're going to learn, for the first time, what building something actually means." "Building?" she asked, her voice small. "Harlan," I said, the name landing with weight in the cheap diner. "Our grandfather. You think he built Ridgeline to buy you yachts? You think he poured his sweat into those first apartment buildings so Gregory could buy his golf partner a phantom job?" I shook my head, a cold anger rising in me. "He built this company to build lives. He built homes people could afford. He gave people jobs they were proud of. He built communities. That is the work. Lena, what you did? That was just alchemy, trying to turn paper into gold. It's not real, and it's over." I stood up. I pulled a $10 bill from my coat pocket and laid it on the table. It was more than enough for the coffee. "You cannot come back to Ridgeline until you understand why it exists. You cannot be part of the work until you've done the work on yourself. When you figure out what that means, you know where to find me. Until then, you are not ready." I walked out of the diner, leaving her in the booth, alone with the terrifying, empty, and perhaps hopeful space of her own identity. The work of rebuilding was slow, but it was real. We were pouring concrete, not just moving numbers. The 48-hour deadline I gave my father passed. On the 47th hour, the signed documents arrived at Martin's office by courier. the transfer of his remaining 20% of non-voting shares, the signed restitution agreement, not a word, not a note of apology, just a signature. It was a surrender. A week later, a text message appeared on my phone. From his new, non-company number. It was a link to an article in the New Harbor Business Chronicle. The headline was glowing. Ridgeline's new mandate. How Sabrina Calloway is trading glass towers for community roots. Below the link, a single message from him. A very favorable article, well done. He was praising my press coverage, even in his exile. He could only see the reflection, the spin. He still didn't understand the work. He was testing the waters, trying to find a way back in, to manage me. I looked at the message. I thought about the 5 years of evidence I had collected. I thought about the t-shirt. I thought about the wine stinging my face. I deleted the message. I blocked the number. The boundary had to be absolute. The real work was far more satisfying. The Harlan Education Fund, now fully capitalized by Gregory's restituted shares, announced its first round of scholarships. We awarded 100 grants, covering full tuition to state universities, to the children of Ridgeline employees, from Maria on the cleaning crew to the project managers in the field. I sat in the front row as Maria's son, Miguel, the one Harlan had helped get into a good high school, accepted his scholarship to study civil engineering. He was going to be the first in their family to graduate college. Maria held my hand, tears streaming down her face, and just kept whispering, "Harlan's heart, he gave you his heart." That was real. The Watercrest Project, Lena's $50 million monument to vanity, became the flagship project of the new Ridgeline. I sat down with Councilwoman Davies and the architects. We tore up the plans for the ridiculous duplex penthouses and the private cinema. The new design, approved by the city in record time, was a model of mixed-use development. 30% of the units were reserved for the city's affordable housing lottery, earmarked for teachers, firefighters, and nurses. The ground floor wasn't a private club. It was a community library and a free daycare center for residents. The acres of wasted landscaping became a public playground and a community garden. It was still profitable. The tax abatements were significant, but it was a different kind of profit. It was the kind you could be proud of. The culture shift inside the company was palpable. Margot's final post-transition audit report included a new metric, employee satisfaction. It had hit a 10-year high. People weren't just staying, they were engaged. They were proud. One evening, I was alone in the office, the last one to leave. The sea breeze was blowing through the open windows, and the room smelled of the harbor. I had finally made the space my own. On my desk, which was a simple, functional piece of wood, not a granite tomb, I had 2 photographs in simple frames. One was an old, black-and-white photo of Harlan, smiling, wearing a hard hat, his arms slung around a younger, prouder Frank, standing on the raw foundation of his first-ever building. The other was a new photo. It was a chaotic, joyful shot my teaching assistant had taken at Northside Elementary just last week. It was a picture of my entire 3rd grade class, covered in paint and glue, proudly displaying the model city we had built out of cardboard boxes and paper towel tubes. Harlan, the kids, the foundation, and the future. My 2 North Stars. I sat back in my chair, looking at the 2 photos, feeling for the first time a sense of quiet, settled peace. The storm had passed. The work was good. That's when my computer chimed. It was just after 8 p.m. The office was dark save for the glow of my desk lamp. A new email had arrived. It wasn't from an investor. It wasn't from the press. It wasn't from Martin Blake. The sender was an anonymous, encrypted address, a string of nonsensical letters and numbers. There was no subject line. There was just a single line of text. You fixed the books. You didn't check the foundations. They are moving the last piece, 4:30 a.m., tomorrow. A cold dread, sharp and instant, cut through the peace of the office. It was a feeling I hadn't had since the party, a tightening in my chest. I knew, instantly, who they were, the old guard, Gregory's cronies, The men who had been feeding at the trough of his shell companies. The ones who had lost their consulting fees. The final battle wasn't over. It had just gone underground. The peace was a memory. The cold dread from the email was a physical presence, a knot of ice in my stomach. The work was not good. The work was not over. My hand was on the phone before I had even finished reading the message. I did not call the police. I did not call Martin. Not yet. I called Margot. She answered on the first ring, her voice wide awake, sharp. You got it, too. It wasn't a question. Who sent it? I asked, my voice low. A ghost, she said. Someone from Harlan's old IT team. I'd guess. Someone he kept on a private retainer. A break glass in case of fire asset. He's telling us to be at our posts. They're coming over the walls. 4:30 a.m., I said, reading the time. That's the final shareholder vote. The one to make me permanent CEO. It's set for 9 a.m. tomorrow. They're not trying to stop the vote. They're trying to make sure there's nothing left to vote on. A scorched earth maneuver, Margot said, her voice grim. If Gregory can't have the company, he'll burn it. He'll liquidate the assets and run. Not on my watch, I said. I need Evan Pierce, our head of IT, the new one, the one we just hired from that cybersecurity firm. Get him. Meet me at the office. Now. I was there in 20 minutes. Margot and Evan were right behind me. The 40th floor of the Ridgeline building was dark, silent, save for the hum of the servers and the distant lights of New Harbor. We turned my office into a war room. We didn't turn on the main lights. We worked by the glow of our screens. Evan, a quiet, intense man with lightning-fast fingers, plugged his laptop directly into the mainframe port, bypassing the standard interface. I'm in at the root, he whispered, as if the old system could hear him. I'm watching all outbound traffic, every escrow account, every wire protocol. Margot and I drank bitter, black coffee from the break room, pacing the dark office, watching the city sleep, watching the digital clock on Evan's screen tick toward the appointed hour. 4 a.m., 4:15, 4:20. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb squad, listening for a tick. At 4:28 a.m., Evan held up a hand. Wait, I've got something. A pre-authorization query. It's old, deep in the legacy code. At exactly 4:30 a.m., the system lit up. An alert flashed across Evan's screen, bright red. There it is, he breathed. Outbound wire transfer, Watercrest Project escrow account. Amount? My God, $22 million. Where is it going? Margot demanded, rushing to his screen. A numbered account, Cayman Islands. Untraceable, Evan said, his fingers flying. But that's not the interesting part. This isn't a new instruction. This wasn't a hack. This was a time lock, a dead man's switch. It was embedded in the system. Christ. 8 months ago. 8 months. Before the party. Before I had any idea. Gregory had been planning this all along. He knew. One day, his house of cards would fall. This was his escape hatch. The email was right, I said, the cold dread turning into a cold, hard rage. They are moving the last piece. Evan, the trigger. What triggered it? A time lock has to be activated. Evan's eyes were wide. It required a 2-key authorization, executed in the last hour to release the funds. I'm tracing the IPs now. He stared at his screen. I've got them. 2 of them. The first one. The IP address is registered to a residential condo, 155 Harborview. Gregory's new address. And the second? Margot asked. Evan looked up from his screen, his face pale. The IP address traces to the registered office of Harbor Consulting. My blood ran cold. The shell company, the golf partner, Jack Riley. It wasn't just a vehicle for theft. It was his co-conspirator. This was it. The final, undeniable proof. I grabbed my phone. Martin, wake up. We have them. I put the phone on speaker, my voice fast, precise, laying out the situation. The 4:30 a.m. wire. The 22 million, the dead man's switch, the 2 IP addresses, Harbor Consulting, Gregory's condo. They are actively liquidating the company's primary asset, I said. This is a criminal act, right now. Martin's voice, when it came, was not sleepy. It was the voice of a general. A time lock, a dead man's switch. That's not just theft. That's premeditated racketeering, asset preservation. I'm invoking the full power of the Trust's preservation clause. I need a judge. Can you get one at this hour? I asked, my heart pounding. I can, he said. Judge Porter. She's the night duty magistrate for emergency warrants. After the party, she gave me her private cell. She said, if that family tries anything again, you call me, day or night. It's night, Sabrina. I'll call you back. The line went dead. The next 5 minutes were the longest of my life. On Evan's screen, a progress bar for the wire transfer ticked slowly. It's a big transfer, he said, his voice tight. It has to clear 3 international protocols. We have maybe 15 minutes, max. My phone rang. I snatched it. Martin. It's done, Martin said, his voice victorious. Judge Porter has signed the emergency injunction. She's freezing all assets of Ridgeline Urban Partners, all accounts associated with Gregory Calloway, and all accounts associated with Harbor Consulting. It's a temporary 60-minute freeze. I'm faxing it to the bank's emergency compliance division right now. She also said, and I quote, get him, Mrs. Blake. Is it fast enough? Margot asked, watching the progress bar. As if on cue, the bar on Evan's screen stopped. It froze. Then it flashed a new message. Transfer halted. Compliance override 77A. It's done, Evan whispered, slumping back in his chair. The bank got the order. The freeze is in place. The money is held. We got it. We saved it. I closed my eyes, letting out a breath I'd been holding for, it felt like 5 years. And then my desk phone rang. The sound, a shrill, digital ringing in the dark office, made all 3 of us jump. It was the internal line, from the lobby. I picked it up. This is Sabrina. It was Frank, the night shift security guard. His voice was trembling, high with panic. Ma'am, Miss Sabrina, you need to come down here. There's 3 men. They used an old executive key card. They're in the records room. They're loading boxes. They're loading dollies with the watercrest files, the paper files. The second part of the attack, they weren't just taking the money, they were destroying the evidence. Frank, call the New Harbor Police, right now, I said, my voice ice. Tell them there is an active robbery in progress at the Ridgeline building. I am on my way down. I hung up. I looked at Margot and Evan. They're trying to steal the hard copies. I ran for the elevator. I hit the lobby button, my adrenaline surging. A cold, clear fury in my veins. This was not a negotiation. This was a war. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. It was exactly as Frank said. 3 men in dark suits, their faces grim, were wheeling dollies stacked high with document boxes toward the service exit. Frank and his partner, an older man named Sal, were trying to block them, but they were unarmed security, and these men were moving with purpose. Stop! I shouted. My voice echoed in the high marble atrium. The men froze. They looked at me. A woman in a wrinkled coat, my hair a mess, standing alone in the middle of the lobby. One of them, a man with a hard, flat face I recognized as Gregory's old fixer, his shadow sneered. Get out of the way, little girl. We're on company business. He pushed his dolly forward. You are trespassing, I said, my voice low and dangerous. I took a step toward them. You are committing theft. Every single thing on this floor is being recorded, and the police are on their way. The man laughed. The police? We have authorization from Mr. Calloway. He's still the CEO until 9 a.m. No, I said. He's a terminated employee, and you are his accomplice to fraud. As if summoned, the wail of sirens cut through the pre-dawn quiet. growing louder, then stopping, bathing the lobby in flashing red and blue lights. The revolving doors burst open, and 2 New Harbor police officers entered, their hands on their holsters. "What's going on here?" the lead officer barked. "Officer," I said, pointing at the men, "I am Sabrina Calloway, the acting CEO of this company. These men have entered the building under false pretenses and are attempting to steal corporate property, the evidence of a $22 million wire fraud, to be exact." The fixer's face went white. The word police was one thing, wire fraud was another. As the officers moved to secure the men, to cuff them, my gaze was pulled past them, through the flashing lights, to the sidewalk. It had started to rain, a cold, miserable drizzle. And standing in it, just beyond the building's awning, was my father. He was wearing a suit, but no overcoat. His silver hair was plastered to his skull. His face was slack, his eyes empty, as he watched his men get arrested. He looked, for the first time in his life, small, a man who had lost his last, final, desperate gamble. I watched as the police put his men in their cars. The rain kept falling. He didn't move. I walked slowly, across the marble, through the revolving doors, and out onto the wet pavement. The cold air hit me. I stopped a few feet from him. He looked at me, his eyes hollow. "Sabrina," he whispered. His voice was a dry rattle. "It's over, Father," I said. He just stared at me. "The wire transfer," I said, my voice quiet. "Just for him. The $22 million, it's frozen. Judge Porter signed the injunction. The bank has the order, the IPs, one from your condo, one from Harbor Consulting. We have it all." He finally, visibly, crumpled. The last string of his arrogance snapped. "The police are here," I said, as the officer in charge walked toward us. "This is your last choice, the very last one I will ever give you." I invited him into the lobby, out of the rain. "Come inside. You're getting wet." He followed me, a dripping, broken automaton. I nodded to Frank, who, stunned, handed me a dry towel from the security desk's lost and found. I handed it to my father. He just held it, his hands shaking. "The police are taking your men. They are taking the evidence. They have every right to take you," I said. I looked him in the eyes. "You have 10 minutes. Martin Blake is on his way. You can sign a full confession. You can sign a full restitution agreement for this, and for everything else. You can give us the names of every one of your co-conspirators. You do that, and I will ask the DEA to focus on them, and not on you." He looked up, a flicker of desperate hope. "Or," I said, my voice hard as the marble beneath us, "you can say nothing, and in 10 minutes, I will personally walk over to that officer, and I will have you arrested for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and you will spend the next 10, maybe 20 years, explaining to a federal prosecutor why you tried to burn my grandfather's legacy to the ground." The choice was his, 10 minutes to sign, or 10 years in a cage. The sun was coming up. At precisely 9 a.m., I walked into the main boardroom, the 40th floor. The air was thick with a tension so profound it was almost liquid. It was a full house. Every investor, every partner who had been at my birthday party, was present. They were not here for a simple vote. They were here for the end of a war. They were the witnesses, and they had returned to see the verdict. Richard Ames was there, Sarah Jenkins from the bank, Councilwoman Davies, the tech CEOs, the hedge fund managers, the 50 millionaires, their faces grim, anxious, no longer looking at me with pity, but with a new, terrified respect. They were all staring at the head of the table, where I now stood. I did not sit. "Good morning," I said, my voice clear in the silence. "I know you are all here for the final vote on my appointment as CEO. Before we cast that vote, I think it is essential that we are all reminded of the exact circumstances of this transition. We need to remember why we are here." I nodded to Margot, who was at the AV controls. "Margot." The lights in the boardroom dimmed. The massive screen at the end of the room. the one Gregory used for his intimidating quarterly projections, lit up. It was not a spreadsheet. It was not a graph. It was a video file. The security footage from the private room at Maison Delacroix, the timestamp, a glowing orange in the corner, showed the date of my birthday. I pressed play. For 45 seconds, the room was forced to watch. They watched Gregory stand, his glass high. They heard his voice, crystal clear, fill the room. Proof that not all investments pay off. They watched Vivian and Lena push the orange bag toward me. They watched me pull out the t-shirt. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the text. Another year of disappointment. They watched Lena hurl the wine. They watched it hit my chest. They watched me stand perfectly still. But most importantly, they watched themselves. They saw their own half-hidden smirks. They saw their uncomfortable, complicit laughter. They saw the investors who looked down at their plates, saying nothing. They saw the exact moment they all chose to be bystanders. The clip ended. The screen went black. I had Margot turn the lights back up, bright. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy with their shame. "My father," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner, "called me a burden. He said it because I chose to teach children in a low-income neighborhood, because I chose to build people instead of just properties. He saw that as a liability." I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of every single person. He was right. I am a burden. To his way of thinking, to a way of doing business that values profit over people, that builds monuments to ego on a foundation of fraud. If choosing integrity is a burden, then starting today, this company is going to learn how to carry it. Starting today, Ridgeline Urban Partners is going to carry this entire city. I looked down at the table. In front of me were 3 stacks of paper. "And we will start," I said, "by making it official." I picked up my pen, the same one I had used at the party. "First," I said, signing the top document with a firm, clean signature, "my formal appointment as Chief Executive Officer of Ridgeline Urban Partners, as approved by the new controlling trust." I slid the paper to Martin Blake, who sat beside me, and picked up the next. "Second," I said, signing it, "the finalized, fully funded charter for the Harlan Education Fund, committing 10% of all net profits, in perpetuity, to the families of our communities." I slid it to Martin, and picked up the last. "And third," I said, signing the heaviest document of all, "a new binding covenant for this board and this company. It is called Ridgeline Builds People First. It is not a slogan. It is a new key performance indicator. From this day forward, executive bonuses, including my own, will be tied not just to profit margins, but to the measurable well-being of our employees and the long-term health of the communities we serve. We will profit with people, not from them." I put the pen down. I had built my new foundation, in ink, in front of all of them. "My grandfather," I said, "did not just leave me a company, he left me his rules for the game." I reached down beside my chair and lifted a heavy, polished, wooden box. I placed it in the center of the massive boardroom table. I opened the lid. Inside, on worn velvet, was Harlan's antique ivory chessboard. "He taught me to play on this set," I said. I picked up one of the pieces. He had a name, a value, carved into the base of every one. I held up the king. "The king is integrity. You lose this, you lose the game." I held up a rook. "The rooks are tenacity. You hold your ground." I held up a knight. "The knights are courage. You make the moves no one else sees coming." Then, I picked up the most powerful piece on the board. "And the queen," I said, my voice softening. "He carved with the word responsibility, the power to move anywhere, to do anything, but bound by its duty to protect the king." I placed the queen, responsibility, in the very center of the table, directly on the new People First Charter. This is our new guiding principle. Responsibility is our queen. Integrity is our king. I looked at Martin Blake. "Martin, the update." Martin stood, his small, precise frame radiating a new authority. "Thank you, Madam CEO. I have a brief report. At 5:03 a.m. this morning, after a failed attempt to liquidate $22 million from the Watercrest escrow, Mr. Gregory Calloway signed a full and complete confession." A series of sharp, shocked gasps filled the room. "He has detailed the conspiracy," Martin continued, "implicating his co-conspirators, including Mr. Jack Riley of Harbor Consulting. He has agreed to repay every dollar he and his associates diverted. He has signed a permanent, binding non-interference order, barring him from any and all Ridgeline business. In exchange for his full cooperation, the district attorney's office has agreed to focus its prosecution on his co-conspirators. Mr. Calloway's association with this company is, as of this morning, permanently and completely severed." The finality of it was absolute. The reign was over. As Martin sat, a hand rose in the back of the room, a hesitant, trembling hand. It was Lena. She was not dressed for a boardroom. She was in the same simple clothes from the diner. She looked pale, exhausted, and utterly terrified, but she was there. I looked at her. "Miss Calloway, you wish to speak?" She stood, her voice shaking, but she did not break eye contact. "Yes, thank you." She looked at me. I know I have no right to be in this room, but I did what you said. I went to the Northside Community Center. I served meals for the last 2 weeks. I read to the children. They don't know my name. They just know me as the book lady." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "You were right. I was a nobody. I was a title. I don't want to be a title anymore. I don't want to be a VP. I want to learn the work, the real work. I'm asking this board, and you, Sabrina, for a job as an entry-level community analyst, non-management. I just want to learn how to build something real." The room was stunned into silence. This confession, this raw public plea for redemption, was more shocking than the fraud. I held her gaze. I saw the fear, but I also saw the first, tiny, flickering spark of the person she might become, the person Harlan would have wanted her to be. "Your request is noted," I said, formally. "We will review it." I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. The work could begin. She sat down, her hands shaking. Then, Richard Ames stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, a sign of deep respect. He looked at me, his eyes, the eyes of a shark, full of a new, profound emotion. "Miss Calloway." "Sabrina," he said, his voice thick. "At that dinner, you stunned us. You left us all absolutely speechless. This morning, you have given us something far more valuable than shock. You have given us trust." He began to clap, not a polite, obligatory applause, a real, solid, resonant applause. Sarah Jenkins, the banker, stood and joined him. Councilwoman Davies stood. One by one, every single person in that room. The 50 millionaires who had laughed, who had pitied, who had turned away, got to their feet. The room thundered with a standing ovation. At that moment, I nodded to Margot. She hit the final slide on the projector. It was not a spreadsheet. It was a grid of 100 photographs. The faces of the first class of the Harlan Education Fund, bright, hopeful, diverse faces, and in the very center, a picture of Maria's son, Miguel, holding his acceptance letter to the state engineering program, his mother weeping with joy beside him. Richard Ames saw the photos, and his applause faltered, the tough-as-nails investor. He had tears in his eyes. I let the applause die down. I looked to the back of the room, at the small camera recording this meeting for the entire company. "My father's team tried to steal documents this morning," I said, speaking to the camera, to my employees. "Because documents don't lie. People do. They were terrified of the truth. From now on, in this company, our documents, our ledgers, our contracts, our financial statements, they will be our strength. They will be transparent, and they will be used to protect the vulnerable, not to exploit them. A final person stepped forward, Judge Elaine Porter. She was not here as an investor. She was here as a witness. She was holding a small, dark object, a small wooden gavel, worn smooth with age. "Sabrina," she said, "this was Harlan's. He used it to call to order the very first board meeting of Ridgeline Urban Partners. Over 40 years ago, he left it with my late husband, his first lawyer. He said, 'You'll know when the rightful heir is ready for it. I believe the time has come.'" She placed the gavel in my hand. It was heavy, solid, real. I turned to the board. I looked at the investors, at the pictures of the students, at Lena, at Margot. I lifted Harlan's gavel, and I struck the table. A single, sharp, resonant crack that echoed through the room. "The long game is over," I said. "Let's get to work." The meeting broke, not in silence, but in a roar of energized conversation. Ames was already talking to Davies about the Watercrest project. Jenkins was shaking Margot's hand. I walked to the vast glass wall of the boardroom, the one that overlooked the executive hall. He was there. My father, standing in the hallway, his suit rumpled, his face gray. He was looking in, watching this new world, this new energy he could not be a part of. He was a ghost in his own palace. I looked at him, through the glass. I did not open the door, but I did not close the blinds, either. I let him watch. I let the bright, clear, morning light flood the room, showing him every single thing he had lost, and everything we were about to build. Thank you all for listening to this story. I'm so curious to know where you're listening from. So please drop a comment below and let me know where you are in the world. I'd love to connect with you and hear your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories and like this video. And if you can, please support us by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.